Well, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to our session, The Right Fit Faster, Teacher Recruitment and Hiring for Small Networks and Single Site Schools. I'm Wayne Tam, co-founder, CEO of Selected, and joining me today is Alex Corson, Chief Director of Partnerships and Community at Selected. And so for those who do not know what Selected is or what we do, our mission as an organization is to give schools greater access or help schools gain greater access to qualified, diverse, and relevant teachers. We have a community of over 50,000 teachers. Over 40% of them identify as teachers of color, people of color, and over 1,500 schools have used Selected across the country since our founding in 2016. And so we feel like we know a bit about the small school, the smaller school, smaller network, and charter school experience. The vast majority of schools who've used Selected are charter schools. So we'd love to share what we've learned in this presentation. So 3 learning outcomes for today. The first is to understand leading trends in teacher recruitment. 2, discover how to play to your strengths as a smaller organization. So we're going to focus really on the experience of smaller organizations and how you can outperform and win relative to larger organizations in your area. And 3, identify the biases holding back your recruitment team. First, it turns out that many of the leading trends are headwinds, and so we'll start there. First, if this year feels slower in the recruitment cycle, or the number of candidates or quality of the candidates has been lower, that's not you. According to our data on our platform, if you compare the first today versus a year ago, so the first 6 months of this year, 21, versus the first 6 months of 2020, the number of active job-seeking teachers is down 30%, roughly 30% in most urban areas across the US, where the areas that we serve. And so we're seeing that on our platform. Last year at this time, most schools were reporting record retention. If you were speaking to me or speaking to folks on our team, most schools were reporting record retention, and that's fantastic. This year is more of a foreshadowing of what you may be seeing in the summer and approaching the fall, is that independent schools, private schools who also use Selected, their season is extending into the summer, which was atypical for them. They usually finish by April, May of any year. They tend to be and like to say that they want to be done before the end of the school year. They of course start earlier in the school year, but that's typical for them. This year, it's definitely extending into the summer. So you just a heads up that this may foreshadow a challenging season, summer and fall for charters and other schools and schools in general. Third, many candidates were unable to complete their exams, licensure requirements, et cetera, during the pandemic, of course. So that could lead to a smaller pipeline of new candidates into the system. And finally, this isn't necessarily a new trend, but it's just a continuing one in that we, in our conversations with schools of education, and we'll talk about this in our presentation, those new graduates a lot of them tend to be misinformed, underinformed about, actually, I don't know why my camera's on, underinformed about the charter school experience. So let's move to, and this is not new, so we'll talk about why recruitment is uniquely challenging for smaller organizations. This isn't new, of course, but just to go through this, some of the challenges that you face: limited staffing, resources, limited discoverability by a core audience. There are many options usually in any given community. If you have larger districts, larger networks, it's tough to be found by your core audience of teachers. It's time consuming because of your limited staffing to build partnerships and maintain and sustain pipelines. And finally, and this is something that's underappreciated, well, not underappreciated, but less spoken about, is that turnover among recruitment ranks really impacts smaller organizations, because you have 1 or 2 people, and lucky to have one dedicated individual. Losing that person has dramatic impact if you haven't set up, if you haven't created pipelines or a process that is sustainable or maintainable, and it results in a significant loss in institutional knowledge. And so 5 steps, I'm sorry why my video is not showing up, not sure, but we'll keep going. There's 5 steps to a repeatable recruitment process, and we're not going to cover all 5. We're going to focus on 3 of the 5 that we think smaller schools can really have a distinct advantage. So jumping to marketing your school and standing out from the crowd, building a pipeline of qualified candidates, and small schools can uniquely do that well, and we'll talk about that. And jumping to step 5, staying in touch with recent hires and candidates you didn't hire. So maintaining a sense of maintaining communications and keeping the pipeline warm. All these steps are critical to recruitment process. We can go deep on every single one of them, but we decided to focus on the few that we thought, due to time constraints, of course, but that would be uniquely valuable to smaller organizations for us to speak about. Okay, so let's start with step 2, marking your school and standing out from the crowd. And so for each of these segments, so we have 3 of them, 3 steps. And before we go into it, we have a Q&A at the end of these. It'll be short, a couple minutes at max, maybe 1 or 2 questions just to set expectations. And please continue to ask questions on the Q&A channel so we can get to these after this event is over, and we'll get to them subsequently. But how this is structured is, we'll talk about a surface level challenge. What a surface level challenge is essentially what we commonly hear from schools. This is something that we hear a lot. The deeper challenge is something that we've added to say, okay, that's a surface level challenge. That's something that we hear often. Well, let's talk about the structural solve, not a temporary solution, not whack-a-mole, but what are some structural solves that we can do to solve the deeper root challenge that hopefully, again, strengthen your overall recruitment process, but build that, but continue to strengthen the entire pipeline. All right, so the surface level challenge here is it's hard enough to find qualified candidates. Basically, you can't find candidates. It's hard to source and hard to find them. The deeper challenge is it's not necessarily you finding them, it's really them finding you. It's being able to articulate your culture fit as a school, know where to look, know who you're looking for, and how to strengthen your marketing. So again, the surface level challenge is I can't find candidates. There's not enough out there. It's hard. It's difficult. The deeper one is how do you get them to find you? Okay, and so the advantages you have as a small school, and we'll go through this in the conversation here, but the advantages you have a strong school culture that once you establish and leverage, that improves your entire recruitment process everywhere, but very specifically on finding qualified, relevant candidates, speed, flexibility, and creativity to move quickly and iterate on the strategies that you're using on the marketing side. Okay, so the first point, and I'll go through these in kind of a couple headlines, and then we'll dive deeper into marketing. But defining and communicating your school culture is critical. Being able not only to articulate and demonstrate your school culture, not only to demonstrate and articulate your school culture is important, and to do it consistently is critical. Candidates, ideally, they come to you, or at least self-select, so you know that they fit your culture properly, or you can, they screen themselves out in a way. These next points are really around using data to optimize and focus your energy. There's so many tools you could use, so many different marketing practices. And so because of your limited time and resources, to focus on those, this is self-explanatory, but focus on those that work. But to document that, to go through the process of understanding which tools actually work, so it's not kind of willy-nilly that you're doing that. And coincident with this is iterate quickly. So don't wait until next hiring season. We've been doing this for 6 years, helping schools understand recruitment, and you feel like you don't have that many bites of the apple of the hiring season. There's just one hiring season year, but really it's year round, and you can start earlier. You can keep improving process, so you can try multiple things during the course of the year. And so what we recommend is establishing a system of experiments, low cost, doesn't have to cost much, doesn't have to cost anything, but A/B testing, things like subjects to emails, email bodies, different events you use, different tools you use, anything that that has an impact on your funnel and your marketing strategies. Try it and continue to refine that and have a culture of experimentation. And then finally, compete where you can win, and emphasize those areas that you're ahead. So if it's things like professional development, if it's your school culture, and we'll talk a lot about that. If it's proximity to public transit, great. Think about the things that you can win on and emphasize those, and not de-emphasize the others, but emphasize the things that you are differentiated in. And so let's jump to the core part of this discussion, which is how do you define your school culture, your school brand, because that is what is going to attract candidates to find you. The first thing is pretty self-explanatory, is not so much because this is literally a separate webinar we could do, but it's understanding your core values in your school culture. Everything is derived from your school culture. People think about what is brand, what is identity. That's really the actions and the structure that come from your core values and school culture, those are things that you do on a day-to-day basis. That's your identity, but your core values and school culture don't change. And so I just listed a bunch of questions that you need to think through if you don't have an identified school culture just yet. But first, start there. Second, you need to, once you have your core values and your school culture, you need to identify your ideal candidate and literally name that person. Have a picture in your head, where this person goes to eat, what do they read, what type of, what do they care about, what is their educational philosophy. Define that identity, because the clearer vision you have of the people that align best with your school will make your marketing efforts so much more targeted and easier to figure out, who is that person, and find partners that align with the values of this individual and your core candidate. And then third, identify ways to attract those candidates to your school. What are you offering your ideal candidate? And I've taken this term from a man named Dan Martell. He does a lot of work in marketing, but he talks about an irresistible offer. What is that irresistible offer? And you should think about your teachers as a customer, or think about it as, I don't know, your Apple, your Amazon, whatever lovely consumer products company, one of your favorite consumer product companies. What is that offer that attracts your core customer? And we'll talk about what that could be. So one example is a school in New York City called the Gateway School. They focus on students with learning differences, and their irresistible offer is professional development. They're a private school, so not a charter school, but they're open to any teacher coming into the school. They're fine and happy and want to train them up. So you can be trained within your first year, to be a full-time teacher working in their school. And these PDs are open to the public. So their whole culture is structured around professional development. So it's both culture, a core value, as well as an irresistible offer. Free PD to be, for a very difficult kind of content area and expertise. Awesome, right? So that's kind of how you put this together. That's a long time coming, though. They've been around for a while, but those are things that you need to work towards. And then next, we can talk about, once you've figured out, I'm going pretty quickly, as you can tell, again, this is a whole separate webinar, but once you've identified your brand, your core values, your brand, your irresistible offer, find ways in commonly used channels, because you know what all of these are, the typical channels, to differentiate yourself. It needs to be differentiated. You need to have candidates stand up and say, oh, okay, these folks are different. Why am I attracted to these individuals? And how do you do that? You do that by creating assets, brand assets, culture assets. We call them magnets, but really they're designed to attract your ideal customer and candidates. So these don't have to be, they don't have to be, maybe it's Starbucks gift cards, probably not, but they don't have to be kind of like gifts or things that you give away, right? So one example is during the pandemic, when things were reopening, Zeta Schools, a small charter network in New York City, they had an amazing blog. I think it's still up, around what they did to reopen in the heart of New York City during the pandemic, literally down to the cleaning solutions they were using, how they set up the diagrams, how they set up the chairs and desks, workflow patterns, and down to the sources of where they derived this information on, because they took it from other people and just wanted to give back. And so that's a demonstrable, offer of content knowledge back to the community. I'm not sure exactly what I can't describe their school culture, but that, I assume, is aligned with it, right? And so those who appreciate that, who understand it, who read that, that's valuable. And so that's an example of your magnet that you can put out there to make sure candidates sit up and notice who you are, because that ultimately will be the way for candidate to help you build a sustainable pipeline and attract right fit candidates.
All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the most common biases and misalignments that we're seeing at this stage. So again, this is figuring out where we're marketing, who we're marketing to. Familiarity and affinity bias definitely is popping up. This is this idea that we're tending to favor groups with similar experiences to our own. We want to work with people like us. But this is actually going to box us in and hold us back long term. And it's a huge disservice to our entire team, most importantly, our students. So thinking about this is looking at people from the same city as us, graduating from the same school. Maybe we're alumni of the same program, same alternative certification program. It's exciting. It makes the interview feel more personal, right? Again, be careful here. You don't want to just be looking for people like you. So to mitigate some of this, think through the strengths and weaknesses on your current team. Identify where you yourself are not quite yet the perfect fit for your school, right? And you're going to have to be honest with yourself, because we know none of us are perfect. So where are you not the perfect fit? Where are your best teachers, your favorite teachers, not yet a perfect fit for your school? And start thinking through all of the ways that even though they're not perfect, they're still great and they're still the right candidates to have in your school building. If you skip that step, you unintentionally write job descriptions seeking people just like you, or just like, again, that favorite teacher that you have on campus, and you're actually going to miss right fit candidates because you're going to miss the potential that is there with those candidates. So that's going to be a very common one at this step. Again, if you are Teach for America and you source from Teach for America, that's fantastic. Don't only source from Teach for America. The other big misalignment here is how our school is perceived. So take some time, reflect on this. You're thinking about, how is it perceived by the faculty at your school, the students, parents, families, the community at large, colleagues, even your funders, right? What do they think about when they hear your school name? How do they feel when they hear your school name? And what words are bringing your school name to mind, as well as when we say your school name, what words come to mind? So think about all of that, and not just from your perspective. Get as many perspectives as possible there. And how are you going to work that into the way that you're marketing your school, or get ahead of some of those thoughts and feelings if they're maybe not what you're hoping people are thinking about? So that's that. And I think next up is actually questions from you, if you have any questions on marketing.
I'm back. Yes. So the question is, how do you recommend addressing a failing school culture that is firmly established? We've had, Alex, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, but we've spoken to schools who, in terms of, that's exactly one question this AP had around, I was recruited to school kind of under false pretenses. And not false pretenses, but it was not clear how challenging the situation was. And his question to us was exactly the same, which is, how do I recruit? How do I do the same? Not do the same. How do I recruit candidates and sell them on a school that I know, has significant challenges? And really, of course, you don't lie, you don't misrepresent what's going on. But I think how you would phrase it or market is just as an opportunity. And go back to and focus on the mission of the school and the opportunity that it presents to people who want to come in and improve critical aspects, infrastructure, school culture, curriculum, whatever the case may be. Those are the people you're going to get anyways, right? Those are the people most attracted to such a situation and likely stay. So you need to market to, what you actually need, and that'll turn out to be hopefully the candidates that are most interested in that type of role. I don't know, Alex, you want to jump in?
I also think this is a deep reflection spot, because when I work with teachers and principals, a lot of the times we talk about right idea, wrong message, right? And the intention is there. There's something really positive in what we're trying to do, but how we are messaging that, how we're actually bringing that, like executing on it, what does that look like in action? It's just not aligned. So this is another spot where I would really think through, what is it about that school culture that is failing? What's the problem here? What have we tried? What's the intention behind what we're trying? And is there something else that we can do there? And then, like Wayne was saying, be really honest with candidates about the areas that you're working on, so that when they come into the school, they're not shocked by something that isn't sitting well with them, and they know that they're being brought on to help change this. I think this is another opportunity to really work with the people you already have on your campus and to figure out, why are they there? What was it about your school that got them so excited to join the team, and to be there every day, and really, again, work off of those strengths as you start to fill in some of those gaps.
Oops. Cool. Should we keep going? All right. Yeah, and please, any additional questions, keep firing away. We'll make sure we get to them, hopefully at some point offline, if not on the presentation. So next step is building pipeline of qualified candidates. The surface level challenge, a complaint that we commonly hear, or challenge that we commonly hear about, is that neighboring district or neighboring districts or larger competitors, larger schools are contracted with universities, a large university and Teach for America. And with a lack of in-person job fairs, sourcing for candidates has been limited. There's just limited options. It feels like all the ideal partnerships or partnerships with the largest sources of candidates has been taken. That's common. That's very common. The deeper challenge and the structural solution that we like to recommend and talk about is really diversifying your channels, diversifying your sourcing channels, and finding right fit partners. It's not the biggest, it's not the shiniest, it's not the folks. It might be those who are just less trafficked, but are less trafficked, smaller organizations, but are better partners for you. So let's dive into this a bit. Your advantages in this situation, this scenario, again, this is why that's why we started with the school culture. Is it's your school culture, and being able to articulate that, and communicate that, and being aligned on what that is, because that helps you identify not only your right fit teachers, but your right fit partners. The speed of your organization, if it's smaller, more direct, more personal, you can cut through a lot of the bureaucracy in building these relationships with universities or other partners. So first, identify the right fit partners to save time. You just have to put in the work, do some research to find those that are aligned with your work and have similar incentives. Similar, again, there's an analog to building your brand and building assets for your potential candidates. It's the same for your partners. What is your hook? What is your irresistible offer to your partners? Is it your alignment and mission? Is it the demographics or the community that you serve? Is it your curriculum? Whatever the case may be, you need an offer because they need to know, why should I work with you versus some other institution. Know your local landscape and prioritize accordingly. Districts tend, I'm going to go through this on a separate slide, but districts tend to have long-standing relationships with large universities and educational organizations. The incentives are a little, large universities are incentivized really to place a significant number of candidates, right? So their priority is placement, not necessarily retention. And so they're looking for an analog, large districts, large networks that can accept a lot of candidates. So that's a trade-off there, and unfortunately hurts smaller organizations who can't make those connections. But identify smaller or less traffic universities. They are likely more receptive to partners and more aligned with you. This is another tip, which is to play the long game. Consider partnerships as an extension of your team. You may be one person, you may be half of a person dedicated to recruitment, but consider these relationships an extension of your team, almost like a concentric circle. The more partners that you have that are quality partnerships, those will feed into your system over time. It's a big investment. We know this. We know this because we spend a lot of time making connections with schools of education, but this investment, while it's kind of like compounding, for those who those who know finance well, as investments compound slowly in the short run, but in the long run, they grow significantly over time. And so the challenge here, though, is that as you have more partnerships, you need to make sure these partnerships are also maintainable. You want to make sure, it may take time to figure out what that ideal partnership for you, because every school is different, every partnership and every value proposition that you have, an offer that you have is different. But once you figure out what that partnership, maybe there's a model that you can keep replicating among multiple partners, right? Make sure it's designed to be maintainable, sustainable, and that it can endure any staff transitions. That's hard, easier said than done, of course, but that's the mindset that you need to have to offset, right? To offset the fact that one large district or one network, all they have to do is go to the large university and make one connection, or you can't do that. You're going to have to do 2, 3, 5, 10, I don't know, but make sure that those partners, those partnerships and how they're designed is scalable and designed for that. And this is another point, is use technology, what's available out there, third parties, to scale your geographic and demographic reach. What's difficult for many schools, particularly smaller schools, is reach. And of course, brand recognition, all that stuff. But use recruitment platforms that can pre-screen for interest in charter schools and your region. It's hard, for example, it's hard to find candidates in other states that want to come home, right? Or that want to come to where your school is. They don't know what schools, what opportunities that exist back home. But you need to figure out a way to find them who want to come back to your community. So there are recruitment platforms out there that let you do that. So we can move on to talk about finding and establishing partnerships. This is a slight deep dive into partnerships that we just talked about, but just a little more detail is research potential partners and prioritize the likeliest partner. There's a lot of opportunities out there, right? But that's why it's challenging, because this is kind of like it's a deep hole. And so focus on those that you actually get responses from, which again are likely to be smaller and less trafficked universities who are open to charters and also private schools those who want to expose their students to more, who are open, and universities specifically interested in saying, hey, I want my students to have 1 year or a semester of student teaching in a Title I school. There are universities out there that have that as a requirement in their for their graduating students, and who have a different culture, or culture that's more aligned with your school. Next, not surprisingly, I spoke about this, is what's in it for universities? What's in it for them? What is your offer? I mean, in addition to, of course, employment opportunities for their students, but what else? Is there anything else? How are you differentiated? That's a question that you'll have to figure out. And then finally, and probably not most importantly, but all this can crumble if someone leaves, right? All this can crumble if the key kind of point person goes away. And so once you establish a partnership and design it, how do you lighten the load? How do you make this sustainable, maintainable? How do you replicate these partnerships across the board? That will help make this feel like a lighter lift. Again, high investment up front, but the payoff will come over time. And we measure recruitment success, not in a single year, even 2 years, but how sustainable is it over multiple years? That'll be the measure of the test of success for your recruitment process.
And then before we jump into this, just one more quick piece on schools of education and partnering with smaller schools of ed. They're not just open and interested in it. It's a kind of two-way street there. It's a problem on both ends, in that those smaller universities can't get a lot of their students into those larger districts because of the contracts that the districts have with the larger universities. So they're in a very similar position as smaller networks and single site schools, and just needing to form those relationships and build those connections. So they're more than open and interested. So it's to start. And then of course. And then as we jump into some of these common biases and misalignments at this stage, these are going to go into multiple points of the hiring process. Probably all of them. This may also further address that first question that was asked about failing school cultures that are firmly established and how you address that. So these are things to think about. First thing you want to do is consider your requirements versus your preferences. A lot of times we actually lead with the preference rather than that requirement for the job. So if we recruit from TFA, again, that's fantastic, but you don't want to only source from Teach for America. Remember, that's the same thing for only one specific alternative certification program, one specific university. You want to diversify that, and remember that homogeneous sourcing channels are going to lead to homogeneous hires, and we'll talk about why that actually hinders performance in the long run. So we recruit from TFA, that's fantastic, but what about local community-based organizations? Who do you already have in-house? Who might you be able to train up? What does that look like? And what's the process in making that happen? Remember, again, we're thinking about structural solves here, so these things might take a little bit of time, but that's an area you definitely want to look into. We've also got this notion that candidates from X university are stronger than those from Y university. Are they? Is that really true, or are we just preferencing students from a certain university? It's too hard for students to understand people with foreign accents. Is it? Is it though? And is that you thinking that? Is that something we've actually heard from the majority of our students? Is this a comfortability factor? Think about that. She's too quiet to command a room. Are you sure about that? Is that really, are we really able to take something about someone's volume or how they stand in a room to mean that? Maybe it does. But if that's the assumption we move forward with, how are we checking that, right? How do we really make sure that that is true? Last one here, this person took the same pathway I did and I trust their training. Should you? Should you do that? Can we just blindly take their training to be the same as ours and move forward, right? So definitely be reflecting on these things. You also want to watch for the halo and horns effects. So the halo is when we are focusing way too heavily on one great feature, right? Again, oh, they came from the same program I did. They graduated from the same school, therefore I trust their training. I'm so focused on that great characteristic that I really prefer that I'm going to miss large skill gaps or even red flags, right? And now we've started the school year and things are starting to fall apart. And I'm wondering what happened. This isn't the person I thought I interviewed. Oftentimes it's because we had those rose-colored glasses on, right? And we had this halo effect in play. The horns effect is going to be the opposite of that. We focus too heavily on one negative feature and we miss a candidate's potential completely. Right? We're just so focused on that one thing. Oftentimes what we're seeing here is it's the GPA. Remember, a GPA does not give us the full story. Unless we really dive into transcripts and really truly understand each individual program that is out there, we don't know how difficult one candidate's courses were compared to another candidate's. We don't know who was working full-time and who was only focused on classwork. We don't know who had family obligations, who got sick during that period. We just don't have a full story. So to take a GPA number at face value, it's very dangerous. So that often is a horns effect at play. And then when we're thinking familiarity and affinity bias, this is, for me, I think the easiest way to keep this top of mind. And this is this idea, again, that if you look like me, sound like me, and act like me, I just subconsciously assume you think like me, right? We're the same. I ask you fewer questions. I challenge you less often. I also fill in the blanks for you, right? You said this, but I know that you actually meant this. Oh, you didn't say this, but I know that that's exactly what you would do, right? I give you all these positive pieces. I'm going to throw them in there. If you don't look like me, sound like me, or act like me, well, I assume then you don't think like me. And I ask you more questions and I challenge you more often. At the surface level, we might think, oh, that's problematic. We don't want that. But that's exactly what we want, right? This is, again, this is this idea that it's not the answer that enlightens, it's the question. We want a team of people bringing in new perspectives, challenging what we're saying, really making sure that if that's an assumption we're making, we can stand behind that and feel really good about the solution we're about to put in place, the hire we're about to make. Remember that the more diverse your team, the smarter your team, and the stronger your process will be. Take a look at this next slide. We're going to break down some of these biases by name. Stick with me here. There are a lot of them, but I think some of them might start to feel familiar. So, attribution bias. This is just fascinating in the way people, just how we work and how we function. We tend to take our own accomplishments and attribute that to our skill, our personality, our hard work ethic, right? We did that. We took that and we made that happen for ourselves. We also attribute our failures to things outside of our control, right? These are external factors, things I could not help. And had that thing not happened, it would have been another accomplishment for me. I would not have failed in that situation if that other thing hadn't gotten in my way. On the flip end, though, when we're talking about other people, we take their accomplishments and we say, well, they're just lucky. They were in the right place at the right time. They knew the right person, right? They got lucky with making that accomplishment happen. Their failures, on the other hand, well, those are personal qualities. Those are skill gaps. That's just a lack of education or training. And we all tend to do this, right? So this is attribution bias. Keep that in check. Be ready to reflect on that. Why did we think this of them? And I'll give a couple examples here a little later on. Conformity bias and authority bias. You want to put a committee together for your hiring team? Yes, do that. But think about these biases because they will come into play. This is when we're not thinking about influencer effect or power dynamics. All right, so conformity is our views are being swayed by other people in the group. This can happen with anyone in that group, right? Anyone can make the rest of the group kind of conform to some idea, some opinion on a candidate. How are we going to make sure that's not happening, right? We have to think very proactively about this. We're going to show you candidate scorecards in a minute. That's something that could help. Authority bias is, we could see this coming in a couple of different ways, right? But this is the idea that the opinions of someone in an authority position, they're more important and they're more accurate than anyone else. Now, as the school leader, you might just think this of yourself. I want to hear what the team says, but ultimately at the end of the day, I know more than anyone else what we need, and so my opinion will matter more. Keep that part in check as well. It could also be from other people on your team. So whether this is, oh, our school leader just said X, therefore I need to agree with that because, well, I want to look good in front of that person. It's the evaluator, it's the team leader, it's the mentor, it's just the friend, right? It's the teacher who tends to lead the other teachers on campus, even if that's very much in a social setting. Think about those influencer effects that are in play, get ahead of them. Contrast effect. We see this comparing and contrasting happening between candidates all of the time. There's not as big of a problem as that is the one that we're going to talk about here in a minute, because we do want to take the best of the candidates in front of us and make sure we bring them into the school. Where we see this contrast effect really holding us back, though, is when we compare a current teacher and a candidate, right? I know we've thrown the TFA example out here a few times, but let's say we got a core member last year. They were phenomenal. And that new core member we're interviewing has to be just like them because they were so good. This leads to harsh judgments, unrealistic expectations, and again, we miss the potential by trying to get someone so perfect. We forget that we're looking for a right fit candidate and that we actually have a lot of the tools in place to strengthen them. Even if they're coming in right fit, we can make them even that much better as a candidate for our school. Other common biases that we're going to see: gender bias, ageism, name bias, beauty bias. That's big too. People don't think they go into interviews with that, but we do. We like people looking a certain way, showing up in certain types of interview attire. Height bias and nonverbal bias. So these are going to be those body language pieces. I use my hands a lot when I'm talking. I don't know if they're coming up into the screen, but I move them all the time, and that drives some people nuts, right? Some people slouch a little more when they stand. They don't have quite the stance you want to say that person commands the attention of a classroom. Are these things we can teach? Is this a skill area? And is it, again, just a bias? Are we making an assumption that we need to back up with other facts before sticking to that? And in the next bias slide we talk about in the next challenge, I'm going to break that one down a little bit more. What you see here on this slide, though, is one of our promising solves. This is a candidate scorecard. I highly suggest putting something like this together. This means we are standardizing our questions and standardizing our evaluation tool, right? The rubric that we're using for those questions. I want to ask the same questions of every candidate that comes through this process because I want to make sure it's as fair as possible. When I am evaluating them, I want to use a rating scale of 1 through 4. 1 being weak, 4 being strong. I want to get rid of that middle neutral number that allows us to just say, oh, you know, take them or leave them, they were fine. No. We got to decide, are we leaning towards hiring this person? Are we leaning towards rejecting the candidate at this point in time? And why? Keep a note section there. Make sure your team, you yourself included, are putting in here, why are you initially thinking that? And then build in that opportunity to not only self-reflect on what is in that notes column, but start pushing back, challenging on each other, inviting each other in to have a deeper conversation. Why did you think the height of that individual was going to mean they couldn't control a high school classroom, right? Talk about those things and build that culture within your team that is what is expected and desired. We want you to bring a different opinion. Play devil's advocate with the team a little bit here. So that's what we've got with that. I do see that there's a question here. So Wayne, I'll read this one out and we can take it from there. So the first question, would you recommend in-person tactics such as hosting school visits or job fairs for recruitment, or is that too time intensive?
Yeah, so good question. It's hard to say. It's hard to say because it really depends on how your job fair is set up. I think hosting school visits is I think that's a good idea if you can get away with that, or if that's possible. Virtual school visits is something that would be helpful too, because you can get a lot of people from different geographies come in, rather than just limiting people who are directly already in the geographic area. Job fairs are a little more challenging to set up. It's time consuming. Again, it really comes down to execution. And so you'll just have to try it to see, get opinions from other schools. What I've seen the best success are those schools who've been able to be the only, be the one job fair in the area, in their community, know the time of the year where there's no competition. Ideally, you have other schools join with you, so it's not just your school, but multiple schools, maybe at your school in your cafeteria or whatever. But we can talk about, if you want to reach out to me directly or the team directly, we can talk more about that. We just have a couple minutes left in the presentation that would love to get to. So the last step is to stay in touch with recent hires and candidates you didn't hire. This one's pretty simple, which is the surface level challenge is basically, we have teachers who commit and then renege. We tend to start early, but we still have a challenge finding teachers to the very end. The deeper challenge, not surprisingly, is that recruitment is year round. And always be closing. A, always be B, C, closing. Recruitment is year round. And so the advantage you have here as a small school or as a small organization is control of the customer experience. Going to make it personal. You have the speed to offer and close. And again, the strong school culture ties it together, because having a strong pipeline and school culture offers protection from people leaving. If you have people depart, you have a pipeline of backup candidates who are qualified, ready to go, maybe substitutes in your pipeline. You have a warm pool of leads that you've kept up to date in the past. What a lot of schools don't do is keep track of those that you've declined in the past or were missing qualification. The point is to keep up communications with everybody. Any past applicant, any past prospect, you should do it. Most schools do not, surprisingly, and a lot of these candidates came to you. So that's already a built-in relationship that you should continue to refresh over time. It doesn't have to be a newsletter, it could be content, it could be events, other irresistible offers, but always remember that people are dynamic. Just because you declined them last year doesn't mean they're not going to be exceptional the following year or 2 years from now. And then finally, really start early. A lot of schools say they start early, but be first. Cut through the noise. Be first. Our data on our platform shows that 50% of teachers accept the first offer that is made to them. That doesn't mean you willy-nilly extend offers and see who accepts. It means be first or second. If you're third, fourth, fifth in line, it's not that you're not great or even a great fit. They're just fatigued and they don't want, they're done with the process. So I know we have just like 10 seconds ago. I don't know if we get cut off immediately. I'm not sure. But just want to say thank you in advance. Here's some of our contact information: Wayne@getselected.com, Alexandra@getselected.com. If we aren't cut off immediately, then maybe we can come back and finish the common biases and misalignments. You're on mute, Alex.
Just this last one here, because the other ones are in review. Remember, people are dynamic, right? Before that first and second interaction that you have with them, a lot can change. They can finish degree programs, certification programs, licensure requirements. So especially if this is something that was just missed in a checklist for you, they might now have that completed. And then we're humans, we're growing, we're constantly having experiences, meeting new people, and we're changing the way that we see the world. So if they weren't quite right last year, check again, stay in contact with them. And if you are in touch with them, you get to help guide that development. That's amazing. You get to help educate young educators, people looking to change something within their career, and help them become even better teachers. So that is where I will end that one. And yeah, reach out if you have any questions for us.